Okay, this is what I'll do in the next 30 minutes or so, 30 to 40 minutes. I'll give you some perspectives on this whole topic of prevention of Legionellosis. I will give an executive summary of what the standard requires. Then I'll give you some examples. And then finally, as a kind of a conclusion, I'll talk a little bit about the impact of the standard, or what we expect that the impact will be. So we begin with perspectives. Now, you'll have to forgive your American cousin here for presenting a very U.S.-centric view in regard to perspectives. What I'm about to say really is intended mostly for U.S. groups, but before I show you some kind of numbers and disease incident data and so on, let me first just preface all of that by saying, in way of perspective, what we're trying to do here. The ASHRAE standard that we're developing is in accord with American National Standard Institute rules, the ANSI rules. And most of you know a bit about ASHRAE standards, but for those in the room who perhaps do not, let me say there are 3 kinds of ASHRAE standards that are developed in the U.S., and they are method of measurement, design, and standard practice. ASHRAE Standard 188 is a standard practice, and it is code intended, so that in the U.S., these standards are written to rules that would allow a municipality or a state government, even the federal government in some cases, to incorporate the standard into regulatory code. Now, of course, that doesn't apply outside the U.S. necessarily, but in the U.S., this is a very important thing because a code-intended standard written to ANSI rules is a very important thing in the U.S. Now, I have to confess to being a little bit more U.S.-centric. In a moment here, I'll give you some data. But before doing that, I'll just give you a quick timeline. This ASHRAE standard development project began in January of 2006. The proposed standard was unanimously approved for public review by the project committee in July 2010. First public review, which is a very critical aspect of the ANSI standard development process, was completed in November of 2010. Revisions were made and approved in April of 2011. Second public review closed on July 25th, just this last summer. And the responses to comments from the public review are right now in preparation, and that's the work that the committee is doing at the moment. The public review has gone very, very well. There have been many constructive suggestions and comments, but there have also many supportive endorsements from some of the largest organizations in the U.S., including BOMA, AWWA, the Joint Commission for Healthcare Organizations, and many others. Publication will probably be in 2012. Okay, now let me just give you some numbers. I'm worried about showing these to you because they're so just U.S. oriented, but I'm sure you can show. Many of you will already basically know these numbers, or at least the thrust of what the numbers tell us. But it just goes to the why should there be more effort for prevention of Legionellosis. Now, what I've been doing in the U.S. is kind of a Legionellosis by the numbers presentation. This will only take a few minutes, but perhaps you'll find this interesting. What do you suppose that number is? 120,000. In regard to Legionellosis, it is the approximate number of people who have died from Legionellosis in the U.S. since the cause of the disease and how to prevent it was determined 30 years ago. And that's just an astonishing number. And it's just really in many regards unacceptable. And I know we're kind of preaching to the choir here too, especially those of you in the UK, but also around Europe. But in the US, we have seen this number, 217%. What do you suppose that would be? This is the increase in annually reported U.S. Legionella cases from 2000 to 2009. The officially reported incident rate has tripled in this decade. Partly it's because of the reporting and so on. What do you think that number is? I gave you a little hint here because it's color-coded. What? Assuming the audio is adequate, I'm just doing a sound check. It's, this webinar format is excellent in many regards, but the difficulty is no feedback to the speakers. So I can't see you. I can't see you, of course, and I just want to make sure that this is getting through. Well, I'll assume that it is. I don't hear any response back. So what do you suppose this green-colored coded number might be? This is the number of direct health care dollars it costs in the U.S. to treat a single case of Legionella. Here's another green number. What do you suppose 12 is? This is the number of dollars of indirect cost for every direct health care dollar spent on pneumonia due to missed time, disability, and lost productivity in the U.S. Therefore, several billion is the annual cost in dollars to the U.S. economy due to Legionella every year. What do you suppose that number might be? This is the largest dollar jury award so far for gross negligence and other failures in a case of Legionella that resulted in long-term disability and severe debilitation. In this case, this particular case was not fatal. $193 million, and that was upheld in appellate court. But I did want to show you this one newspaper article which indicates that there is currently a suit in a Legionella lawsuit in the United States which was brought for $337.5 million. And the case is against the Dubai World and MGM Resorts for some outbreak cases, none of which were fatal, in the Las Vegas city center complex. Now, the reason I kind of take a moment to show this is because one of the concerns people have when they see a new standard development project in the U.S. is that the standard itself will bring on lawsuits. And this is a valid concern that you'll often hear expressed. But ASHRAE has replied, or ASHRAE's position and the committee in general position on that is lawsuits are already being brought, and big lawsuits in the U.S. here. And after the first few lawsuits are settled, the next ones are settled more easily. So in other words, there's already legal precedent. Okay, now what I'd like to do at this moment is provide for you an executive summary of the standard, what the standard requires. And if I don't get sidetracked here, this should only take about 3 minutes, 3 at the most 4 minutes. The standard is quite simple and therefore potentially very powerful. It should take no longer than a few minutes actually to explain what is required by the standard, and I'm going to do that right now. The first thing the standard requires is the most important part of it. Compliance with the standard will require that facility managers, owners, establish a team with assigned responsibility and accountabilities. The first job for the team is to describe how water is processed and used in the facility. This description must be schematically represented in process flow diagrams with each processing step named and numbered on the diagrams. Next, the team is required to perform systematic hazard analysis, and that requires identification of the potential hazards for each step in the process, a decision about the risks of those standards. These are qualitative risk characterization. It's not a risk assessment in a quantitative sense. It's a qualitative characterization of risk. The team must declare in this hazard analysis summary if the risks are deemed to be significant, yes or no. And if yes, the team must determine what hazard control is being applied or should be applied at that processing step. Every processing step in the building water system at which hazard control is applied must be designated a critical. For every critical control point, the team must address 4 issues about the hazard control used. The critical control limit or limits, the hazard control monitoring method, the frequency of hazard control monitoring, the corrective actions to be taken if critical control limits are violated, and those are the 4 aspects required. Those are the 4 parameters required for each critical control point. Now we're almost finished, actually, in describing what is required by the standard. Lastly, the team must confirm that the overall plan is being implemented, and that's called verification. And 2, provide evidence that the plan is effective, and that's termed validation. And really, that is what the standard requires. Now, I'm going to give you some examples, but before I do, let me make some statements here. And the first thing that I'm sure many in the room have noted is that the standard says what to do, but it does not say how to do it. And that is by design. It's on purpose. It's very much purposeful to develop a standard which says what to do, but is not prescriptive on how to do every aspect of it. Now, let me give some examples, and I'll just do a quick check here. Are we okay, Tim? Assuming we're okay, there's no... Okay. All right, let me give some examples. The first thing that the standard requires, which I declare to be the most important thing, is requiring facility management to require that facility managers and owners take responsibility for this problem and to deal with this hazard in a manner that is adequate and in accord with federal law in the U.S. In the United States, every known hazard, be it biological, chemical, or physical, is governed or is regulated under our safety, occupational safety laws. And the federal law requires that for known hazards that the building owner and manager must protect the employees, the visitors, and the surrounding community from known hazards. And Legionella is a known biological hazard. Now, the first step is in compliance. The first step to comply with the standard is for facility manager owners to accept that responsibility and appoint a team. Now, this is an example of a multiple campus hospital water management team. This is an actual team that exists right now developing their water management program. And on the team are these titles, executive director, director, and so on. And this is the team that would be established to develop the water management plan or program. Now, in the appendix of Standard 188, there are informative guidance documents that give examples. And what I'm about to show you are examples of the HACCP Plan developed for a GSA-managed building water system. GSA stands for General Services Administration. And in the United States, the GSA manages probably more floor space than any other organization, perhaps one of the largest areas, floor space areas in the world that they manage, have been very active on this development committee to produce the Standard 188. And the reason I mention it is they led a development, they led the development of examples for the standard on how to do the various things that the standard requires. So what I'm showing you now is from the appendix in the standard. So there are really 4 things that are given as examples: process flow diagrams, hazard analysis summary, verification and validation summary, and the HACCP plan document itself. Now, I know I've introduced this term for the first time, HACCP. I'll be talking more about it and the acronym, what it means, and how it relates to all of this. But for those of you who are very familiar with this, no need to define the acronym, but for those of you who are not, it just simply means hazard analysis, that's the HA, and CCP stands for critical control point. So let me give you some examples. The process flow diagrams are required for both the potable and utility building water service. The potable water, the drinking water, and other uses for water which require consumable water, that process is always separated from the utility water process in a building water system. And so the standard requires a process flow diagram for both of those systems. This is the potable water, and you'll see it's not a detailed plumbing diagram. It's a process diagram. So see, you can see schematically how the water is received and then how it moves through the building water system. And you can see that each step is named and numbered. And I won't go through the details of this, but you can just see how it's oriented, not to give detail, but rather to give a schematic representation of how water is being processed in the facility. Now here's what the flow diagram would look like for the utility water side of the house. And again, the processing steps are named and numbered, but there's not detail on all the plumbing fixtures and so on. Now that's very important because the next step is what's called hazard analysis. And this is a process which the team must undergo together and is based upon the flow diagrams that the team will have previously developed. Now we won't go through the details here, of course, but let me just read across the top of the table, the top columns. So you see on the far left, potable water is identified. There's a subsystem category that the GSA folks put in just as a reference. But then look at the third column, identify potential hazards introduced. This is where potential hazards are identified for each of the steps in describing how water is moved through the building. And then the team must decide if the risk and severity is significant. So this is very qualitative, yes or no. Now the basis for the risk characterization, see the column in 1, 2, 3, 4, fifth column over from the left. This is the basis for the risk characterization decision that the team makes. And then lastly, what controls could be applied, actually second to last. What controls could be applied or are being applied. If there's no control applied, you can call it a control point, potentially control point. But if there is hazard control applied, like if you drop down to 1, 2, 3, the fourth row down, or the fourth group down, you see CCP, it says yes. And that's because control is applied at this system or should be applied. So the team defines this as a critical control point. And this team is suggesting control that could be applied at the distribution to control the hazard. Now, that's what the process flow diagram would look like for the potable side of the house. Let me see if I can get this to move. There we are to the utility water system, the same format. And of course I won't go through this again, but you can see it's the same format that the team follows to describe each step in the way water is processed in the utility building water system. All right, now at every step at which hazard control is applied, by definition, a critical control point is defined or is established. For every CCP, 4 issues must be decided by the team. I told you before, but they're very important. Critical control limits the hazard control monitoring method. And remember, this is not measuring the hazard itself. That comes later. This is the hazard control monitoring method, the hazard control frequency of monitoring, and the corrective actions to be undertaken if the critical control limit is violated. Now, let me just emphasize this for a moment. This will be a little bit new to those of you who are not too familiar with risk management, HACCP-based risk management. The corrective actions do not refer to what is to be done if there's a Legionella test result indicating detection of Legionella. That is not a corrective action. A corrective action is what is to be done if the critical control limit is violated. So let's say, just for an example, let's say the control limit is chlorine dioxide applied to a potable building water system. This is just an example now, but the critical control limits might be something like, say, 0.2 to 0.5 parts per million chlorine dioxide. The monitoring method might be online and parametric titration. The frequency might be once a day. The corrective action is what the team will do if the critical limit of chlorine dioxide is violated. So it doesn't have anything to do with testing for Legionella. Okay. Now, the next document that I'm showing you by way of example from the appendix is what is often called the HACCP Plan document. And the power of this document is that on one page, the entire control for the building water system is documented, because only the critical control points are at issue, and they are listed for each step at which control is applied. In this particular example, the team chose these steps in the process for control, and then the team lists these 4 factors or parameters that we talked about: critical control limit, monitoring method, the frequency of monitoring the hazard control, and what is to be done if there's deviation from the limits. Then you list the location of the records and what the verification procedure is responsible. So you can see how powerful this is. On one sheet, you distill down the entire plan, and of course it's the essential aspect of the control. All right, now we're very near the end of my examples, but it is important to also mention validation and verification. Validation is evidence that the hazard control being applied is actually effective. That's validation. And this process, the standard, requires validation. That is evidence that the hazard control being applied actually works. The standard also requires verification. And verification is evidence that the plan itself is being implemented. So the two very different things. Validation is evidence that the hazard control is actually working, and verification is confirmation that the plan the team has established is actually being implemented. Now a word on validation. Let's see where we're at here. I'm going to talk about impact here in a moment. Let me go back to the slide. I just want to make sure I make a few comments about validation. Testing for Legionella is in the category of validation because the results from the tests give evidence about the efficacy of the hazard control which has been applied. Now, some would argue that it's a very, very powerful validation evidence, and some would indeed argue that it is the best way to validate hazard control, and there would be some who might argue that it's the only way, but that would be a tough argument. There are other ways to validate. Many have wondered, especially outside the U.S., why the standard does not require specific Legionella testing regimes and routines and why the standard does not prescribe actions based on numerical results from the Legionella test. I'm sure there are some in the room who would prefer that and might even argue for it. And of course, all of us on the committee, the ASHRAE committee, are very aware of the international guidelines and standards that are out there. And by the way, I didn't mention at the beginning, but the membership of this committee is kind of remarkable. If you were to look at the actual roster, there are 24 voting members, but there are about 50 corresponding members, international members, 4 members from the CDC. All of the U.S. experts that you might think of in this field are members. Yeah, so I took that little side course just to make the point that it isn't a matter of us being unaware that Legionella test results are used in a different way throughout all around the world. But let me just say this. After many years of debate and consideration of all the issues regarding Legionella testing, here's what this committee has decided, and I believe quite rightly. Testing is very important. It can be very, very important. However, it must be acknowledged that, number one, testing for Legionella is not a means of control whatsoever. And even though that may sound silly to some of you and obvious that it isn't, I can tell you from bitter experience that there are folks out, many folks who are selling Legionella testing, who make the claim that it is a form of control, or it's so closely linked to a form of control that test results themselves can be relied upon for regulating control. This is not to be advised, nor recommended in any regard. Next, we say that those who would argue for more requirement in Legionella testing should please consider the accuracy and precision in the data. And this would be among the top reasons why the CDC and many others too, not just those folks at CDC, but many other analytical scientists would agree that because of the inherent inaccuracy and lack of precision in the data, Legionella test results should be used with caution. They are valid, pardon the pun, validation results. They can be validation results that are very, very helpful and important, but over-reliance upon them and also setting action levels, say, for example, if the result is above 100 CFU per liter or milliliter, we're going to disinfect the system. But if the result is 85 CFU per whatever unit volume you're looking at, we don't need to disinfect. See, scientifically, that is indefensible because the precision in the data is nowhere near good enough, or it's not adequate for making distinctions like that. So these are some of the reasons why validation evidence is treated in the way it is here. Legionella testing is important when used properly, but it is not to be relied upon. And we understand that that does go a little bit different, or quite a bit differently than what we see around the world in some of the other regulations. One other quick point, I'll just touch on this briefly, but the limit of detection is also an issue that in the Legionella test that we're all very aware of. The analytical scientists know that this idea that 1 or 10 CFU Legionella per liter can be accurately determined is really tough to defend, very, very tough to defend, because quantitative filtration of water samples as a means of concentrating for Legionella is fraught with difficulty. And therefore, there are many analytical scientists in this field who would not recommend nor advise filtering large volumes of water with an expectation that the limit of detection, the theoretical limit of detection, is anywhere near what the limit of quantification is, which is what you actually can measure. And in extensive studies that have been published in peer-reviewed journals, it's really shown that the actual limit of quantification for the Legionella test is 10 CFU per milliliter, not per liter. All right, enough of that. I'm sure there's perhaps some eyebrows raised, and I'm sure folks in the room may not agree with some of the things I just said, but we can also have some time left over to discuss some things about impact. Now, of course, this is, we could talk about this for much longer than I intend to in this presentation, but let me just say a few important things. People often associate this process that the standard requires, HACCP, with food safety, but these principles were not developed for food safety applications. Hazard analysis and critical control point risk management was developed by the United States Armed Forces right after, well, during World War II and right after. The process was picked up and sort of made famous to the general public by NASA and the U.S. manufacturing sector, which has used this process to great success. It's a very powerful process that has been adopted by manufacturing around the world, especially in the U.S. Now, it was adapted by the food safety professionals. So if there are any in the room who were like me years ago when I first looked at this, very skeptical about a food safety process being applied to building water systems, I would just ask you to maybe do a little study of the history of this. And you'll find, I think, that the power in this process is that it declares what must be done, but not how it must be done. And it follows this very well time-tested and documented success from applying the process to many, many different kinds of endeavors, including food safety. In February 2007, the World Health Organization published their 267-page document, which is a free download from the WHO, and it is really the definitive monograph on the subject. I was one of the co-authors, along with about 100 other experts from around the world, the principles of hazard analysis and control, with each chapter arranged around HACCP principles. Now, there are some differences, which I won't go into now in the interest of time, but if you'd like to discuss the difference and why the acronym HACCP is not used in the WHO book, perhaps we can discuss that later if there's time. This work advocates that water safety for all building water systems should be managed in accordance with these hazard analysis and control principles. Facility managers and owners will be required to formally take responsibility for controlling Legionella in their building water systems. I've said that 2 or 3 times in this presentation because of how important it is. And in the U.S., that's a big deal. We're talking about potentially 5 million buildings this will touch. So, of course, there's a lot of discussion about the cost to implement this and so on. The potable water system in buildings, not just the cooling tower, is an equal focus to the standard. You know, one of the reasons ASHRAE is involved in this is because most of these cases are not associated with cooling towers. Most Legionellosis cases actually come from exposure to potable water systems. And if you look at a building, the cooling tower part of the building water system is really, in many cases, very small part of the management challenge for the facility owner. The standard practice will be hard on water treatment providers who are not competent and who cut corners. In the U.S., there's a lot of discussion about this, and some of the water treaters are really very, very upset and concerned and so on because they're going to have to do things that they're not currently doing. Well, you know, the bottom line answer from the committee in technical consensus, according to ANSI rules, is, yep, it's true. There are some water treaters who are going to have a tough time because they're either not competent or they've been cutting corners, and this is as it should be. However, competent water treaters, and we have several of them on the committee and many who have reviewed the entire standard, the competent water treaters are already doing in their own fashion most of what the standard practice requires. So for them to comply with the rest of what's required and to get it in the jargon of proper risk management is, in our judgment, not onerous and is an important important thing for them to do. Compliance with the standard practice is the best defense against an accusation of negligence in cases caused by Legionella from unknown sources. And then finally, and then I'm going to conclude with this, compliance with the standard practice will prevent Legionellosis cases, perhaps thousands of cases every year in the U.S., and that is really what should motivate us most of all. And that is really why I think there has been an increasing level of support for the standard, and really very, very pleased with how the public review process has gone. So with that final statement, I would like to thank you for inviting me, and sorry, I feel very strange talking to an empty office here, so I hope I haven't just bored the heck out of you folks. But I do thank you for your attention, and Tim for organizing the webinar.
Simon French speaking. I've also got an echo, which is a little bit strange. And thank you for getting rid of the echo there, Mr. Facilitator. It's nice to see that you're catching up with exactly the same thing that we're doing, but in the form of your language. We have what's called a risk assessment, as you well know over here, which borns out a schematic diagram. It gives us our control measures, and we have logbooks to record them, and then we have natural auditing, which in the same language, really, we're all trying to do the same thing, and we've been at it for some considerable years. We have, to date, probably still walking into buildings that have never had a risk assessment done. So, you know, with that in mind, you're just starting on this road by the look of it, and from 2012, who will actually police this particular process? As you've got 52 states there all doing their own thing, is that right?
Well, according to President Obama, we do have 52 states, but everyone else in the country is aware that we only have 50 states, so it's not quite as difficult as you think. I'm teasing. Were you able to hear me, Simon?
Right. Well, yeah. The point is, though, that
yes.
Who's going to be policing this for you?
Of course. I know. I got your point. I was trying to make a joke, which is also very difficult on a webinar format like this, so forgive me for that. Yes, let me talk about policing a standard and the way it works in the U.S. Now, again, you're right. I'm very familiar with L8 in the UK, and also with the way regulations and laws work in other countries around the world, including in certain countries in Asia, where regulations can be instituted, and there can be compliance and enforcement much different than what would happen in the U.S. So I'll just describe the way it works here. We are, as you well know, are loath to create federal law. When we do it, we try and make it very difficult, and we make the standard very high for federal law. But when a federal law is passed and implemented, then enforcement is quite strict, and the states must comply with it. Now, the determination from ASHRAE and the committee is we don't need more federal law for preventing Legionellosis, because our health and safety law includes all known hazards, including Legionella. So what we need in the United States is a best practice that has been passed according to the technical consensus rules set up by ANSI. Those are code-intended standards, which can then be incorporated directly into regulations, such as state, federal, or municipal codes, and those are laws. So the policing, to use that phrase, it would be derived from this process, Simon. The first process is, what do the technical experts in the U.S. say must be done? What should be done? Until this standard appeared, you could not point to any technical consensus for what should be done. So the first step in the U.S. is for a technical consensus for what should be done. When that consensus opinion is developed in in language that can be incorporated into regulatory code, then that's the next step. So what we will see, and perhaps very quickly, is that the standard will be incorporated into regulatory code, which then can be enforced. Now, one other, enforced by a government agency. But one other comment on policing. This, you folks will all know too from just observing the U.S. The other thing that happens here is in litigation. What happens in the U.S., unfortunately in many regards, is that the legal activity in the country drives performance. So when a technical consensus document appears, which is code intended and passed according to ANSI rules, there is really no other more powerful standard for negligence than a document like that. And so in the U.S., sadly, in some regards, this is the most effective and powerful motivator for good practice that we have in the States.
Hello, Bill. Simon French again. Do you think this goes far enough with giving them no indication to exactly what it is that they should require in their control measures? As I do read the other ASHRAE standard that's, or standard, the guidance rather, that you have from the year 2000. But would it have been beneficial to put something in there that was a little bit more pinpointing on control measures of various different things, as you stated, with temperature and with chlorine dioxide, etc.?
Yeah, Simon, that's a great question, and it's also a point of discussion and objection. It has been throughout the whole process here. I think the answer is we, that is the committee, think not. It would not be better to put prescriptive indications like that in the standard, because the site-specific considerations that are relevant and critical are so significant, and there's so much variance that trying to standardize any one recommendation with regard to control is so difficult that we believe it creates more trouble and more problems than it solves. Added to that, Simon, in the States there are many excellent guidance documents which are publicly available to everyone. You mentioned one, the ASHRAE Guideline 12, 2000, but there are 12 others that are widely available and used, in which specific recommendations are given for particular building water systems. For example, in regard to temperature, or in regard to chlorine concentration or other oxidants. So what ASHRAE Standard 188 does is say, here's what you will do if you're going to comply with the standard. You will form a team and decide which hazard control is most appropriate for your building. And you will do that in accordance with this risk management process, and then you will validate and verify that thing is working.
Okay, Bill, and one other thing there, Bill.
Mm-hmm.
I'm looking at item 5, determining the risk characterization, and I'm looking at line G. Can you just explain to me, what is the maximum level that you're supposed to deliver in potable water to a building in the US as far as a halogen concentration is, in other words, chlorine?
Right, okay. Let me make sure that I know exactly what you're referring to. Would you have been looking at a hazard analysis summary? Item 5 in the
page 7, chapter it's paragraph 5 or item 5 on page 7, and the line is G for golf.
Page 7. Are you looking at the standard or at my presentation?
Sorry. I'm looking at this final draft of the standard.
Oh, okay, sorry. All right, I don't have that in front of me right. Oh, now I know what you're talking about. You're section 5, yes. Oh, okay, I've got you. All right, yes, that G is right. Now I know exactly what you're talking about. Yes, this and the other items in Section 5 have created quite a lot of discussion, and rightly so. Now, what you have to do is keep in mind what Section 5 and Section 6 of the standard are. They comprise specifications for determining whether or not a water management program is required, okay, for the building water system. All right. So they are just a very rough risk characterization itemized list that is really more inclusive than it is exclusive. Now, item G refers to the halogen residual, and specifically the chlorine residual, that is incoming to building water systems. Now, in the United States, almost all municipalities either chlorinate or chloraminate the water in the water treatment plant and deliver chlorinated water to the buildings. So the committee, the SPC 188, the Standard Development Committee at ASHRAE, determined through its expertise the consensus opinion that if the chlorine residual coming into the building was less than 0.5 parts per million, then the building owner and manager should consider that the risk for biological hazards might be significant. Doesn't mean that if the concentration is higher than 0.5, there's no risk. And it doesn't mean that if there's no detectable halogen, it doesn't mean that the system is declared unsafe. It doesn't mean that. It's just a general parameter. In the United States, to answer your question more specifically, typically the municipalities chlorinate building water, municipal water, to a range of 0.5 to 1 part per million free residual and deliver that to the distribution system. And depending on where the building is located in the distribution system, there may be close to 1 part per million free residual, or there may be no detectable free residual at all. And so Section 5 just lists potential risk characterization items as a means to determine or to specify what building water systems must be managed according to this standard.
So, Bill, would you agree with me that in 99% of cases, that G makes you fall into the second category in Table 1?
Yes, yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I believe that. I'm not looking at the standard right now, Simon, so I believe I answered you correctly, but let me kind of phrase it this way. If you look at all the factors in Section 5, 99%, or I don't know what the percentage is, but in a high percentage of cases, building water systems are will be required to do this process. Will be required to have a water management plan. All healthcare buildings, all buildings that have cooling towers, all buildings that have no chlorine in the water coming in, all buildings and so on. You know, so really the idea is, yes, there are some buildings that really are so simple and so the risk characterization is so low that a water management plan could be, it could be decided that a water management plan is not needed, but that will be the exception. And then Section 6 would further require that if that is the determination by the manager and owner of the building that, no, we don't need to do anything here because we don't have a spa, it's not a healthcare building, They go through all that list, no, we don't have to do it. Then the standard requires that that building manager and owner reassess that once per year. Every year, make that same determination. Okay, yep, there's no need for us to do anything more because we feel strongly that the risk of Legionella from this building is just not so.
Thank you, Bill. And like I said a minute ago, just one more thing.
You're like Steve. You're like Steve.
Testing of Legionella per mil rather than 1 litre. Do you think this might be reflective in hospitals of the reason why you possibly do have 120,000 dead?
Well, now there's a lot of debate on that, Simon, and you know, maybe we could outline some of the contours of the debate, but we certainly wouldn't resolve it here. Let me see. Now you interrupt me now if I'm taking too long a winded answer to this, please. If I was looking at you face to face, I would be able to determine how much is too much in this answer, but I'll kind of launch into this, but please interrupt me now if I'm going on and on. On the issue of testing, there are those of us who feel that more testing and done properly would have contributed to fewer dead. Yes, there are those of us who believe that. However, there are many of us who know for certain that the inaccuracies and the lack of precision in the test results have confused more than has helped in many, many cases, and that the positive predictive value of the data, especially when you get at levels that are in CFU per liter, the positive predictive value is so bad, it's so dismal, that there really is very little correlation between a positive Legionella detection and any associated disease with the building water system. And that's just a fact. And then those of us who are more analytical in orientation say, if we know that numbers CFU per liter are not defensible analytically, that is to say, if you take a liter of cooling water and filter it, the recovery of Legionella from that filtered sample is so unpredictable. Sometimes recovery is much greater than 100%. Other times it's 20%. And so it's, in other words, it's not a quantitative analytical filtration, especially for complex water matrices like cooling water. But even in clean water, like from hospitals, filtering large volumes of water is not quantitative. And therefore, those of you who are more pure science types will say, generating data that we know is not analytically defensible is not to be recommended. Right. Okay, the audio has degraded quite a bit. I believe I understood the question. I'm going to kind of restate it here, but Tim, just so you know, the audio from what I heard was really degraded. I could only hear essentially every other word. So I believe the question is, the second question was, is more federal law required in order for there to be any compliance to be expected? And then the first one was, what would be, this kind of the same question that Simon asked at the beginning, what would be the policing mechanism or so on as it relates to the legal aspects. So let me start with that. In the U.S., what we would have is a very vigorous litigation activity around any kind of technical consensus opinion that has been ratified, so to speak, or been validated according to best practice rules for developing standards. So if right now there is no standard for how to prevent or what to do to prevent Legionella in the U.S. There are guidelines, and they are used in court cases as a benchmark for best practice, but they're just guidelines, they're recommendations. A standard raises that to a much higher level in the U.S. So yes, there will be legal consequences, and they will be stronger than they are presently. Will there be more legal cases, more lawsuits? Maybe. Maybe not. I mean, they're already, I showed you evidence. I mean, how much bigger do the cases have to be? $337 million in one lawsuit. That is, see, the case that ASHRAE and the standards development team would make is the standard will not create more lawsuits necessarily. It might, but the lawsuits are already moving. And just to get at the answer, I think perhaps that, to the question the guy was actually asking, the standard does raise the bar for what would be an accusation of negligence in the U.S. Because if you own a building or manage a building water system in the United States, ignorance of a ASHRAE standard is not an excuse in a court of law. Now, as to whether or not we need more federal law, now again, there will be vigorous debate on this. We have the libertarians in the U.S. who would say absolutely not. And then we would have the folks on the other side of the spectrum who would say, why don't we already have a federal law for this? Name some other water treatment issue that has killed 120,000 Americans. You cannot find one. So why don't we already have federal law? So those are the two ends of the spectrum. In the middle of that spectrum of opinion, I think, is where most of us are, and this is certainly where I'm at. I am not libertarian in the sense that we don't want any law. We don't want anarchy. However, in the U.S., federal law is very difficult to achieve, and also it creates, oftentimes in the U.S., much more trouble and more headache than it actually solves. In a country where it's easier to deal with factions, you don't have 50 states, a governing law which would, I know wouldn't be called federal, but an encompassing law in your country or in one of the European countries is a much different animal, so to speak. My opinion, and I think the consensus opinion of the group, is that the federal law we have right now, which is the General Duty Clause of the OSHA Act, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration Act, this is a federal law, and it is governed in criminal court. And if you are proven, or not you, but I didn't mean to personalize, but if someone is accused and convicted of violating the General Duty Clause of the, that's prison. You go to prison for that. And that law declares that for known hazards, biological, chemical, or physical, the employer and the facility owner are responsible for protecting the employee, the visitors, and the surrounding community. So what's the best practice for protecting people from Legionella? It is this standard practice. And therefore, I would be among those who say we do not need more federal law. In fact, if we get more federal law, it will be because the technical experts failed to do their job. And instead, we have a room full of bureaucrats who decide what they think should be done. And this is something that many of us would shudder at. We would be worried about it. Well, I know that was a long-winded answer. Forgive me for that.
Bill,
are we still there?
Yep, Bill, can you hear me? It's Bob McLeod-Smith here. Good afternoon to you.
Oh, hi, Bob.
Bill, you're very familiar with the concept of the risk assessments that are done here for water systems. And generally speaking, most building owners and facilities managers who don't feel they have the skills to do this themselves. So there are independent risk assessors who do the risk assessment for them. Sometimes the building owner or operator can do the written scheme, which is essentially the plan document as you describe it. But do you foresee, amongst these millions of buildings you describe, that even within the teams that you talked about, there's going to be the expertise to do this hazard analysis, or whether there is a business opportunity for lots of people to set themselves up to do hazard analysis for Legionella?
Yeah, another great question, and an issue of concern and debate by many. I'll tell you the ASHRAE position on this and the consensus opinion of the committee, and then I'll give you my personal opinion. So ASHRAE has been down this road and considered questions like that about standards many, many times in the past. And it's essentially for every standard, especially a standard practice. This always comes out. Now, so you might say the ASHRAE view of this is that whenever a new standard practice is put forward by the technical consensus process, at the beginning of the implementation, there's often a need for education. There's a scramble for, well, what do we do? How do we do it? Who can help us? There's always a demand for expertise, and it is a common factor for any new practice that would be presented. But over time, the demand and need for such outside expertise typically tapers off and in many cases completely disappears. And so the ASHRAE organization doesn't encourage the committee, the standard committee development teams to worry too much about that. Because as long as there's not a requirement in the standard for some sort of consultant or independent facilitator, an absolute requirement for that, then the ASHRAE view is that what the team should do is, as technical experts, decide what needs to be done, and then let the marketplace work out the supply and demand issues that will come from this. And I think this is a very wise thing, very, very wise, because at the beginning there will be a need for education and help and so on, but this process is so simple and so straightforward, and it's also consistent with the process that's used on the food safety side of so many of these buildings. So in the U.S., if you go into any hospital, for example, and ask how food safety is managed in the kitchen, the answer back will always be, well, with HACCP. And so there's a huge standing base of knowledge regarding HACCP, and much of it is internal. All the restaurants in the U.S., essentially every restaurant, all restaurant chains in the U.S. use HACCP to manage food safety in their restaurants. So the expectation then, if you look down the road, is that requirement for independent cottage industry type organizations to do this will become less and less, and also the market forces on this are not to be minimized at all, because if there's a huge demand for people to help, then the cost of providing that help goes down and down and down. Same with testing. If there's more demand for testing and the volume of tests required goes up, then the price goes down. And one of the things I think that's powerful about letting the standards develop from technical expertise and not by bureaucrats is because it separates out the market considerations from just deciding what needs to be done. That's the ASHRAE view. That is the strong consensus opinion of the committee, although there are a couple of individuals on the committee who, in regard to testing, would not agree with what I just said. They want there to be required testing in all these buildings. And not coincidentally, those individuals are also selling tests. So we have to factor that in. Now my personal opinion, I'll make this quick, I'll try to.
Yeah, I've got one more question I'd like to get to you before we finish, if that's possible.
Oh, certainly. So my view is that that the process here is quite different than L8. Now, well, let me rephrase that a little bit. As Simon set up, I think when we first started, it's true that there is much more in common with this approach and L8 than there is divergent. Much, much more. It's more alike. The two approaches are more alike than they are dissimilar. However, there are significant differences, and they have to do with risk assessment. So now this will sound like semantics to some in the room, but I would encourage you, even if you're already an expert, to think more deeply about this. If what I'm about to say sounds like semantics to you, then my recommendation is that you think more deeply about it. Risk assessment implies a quantitative determination about risk. Assessment is a quantitative word. But the risk of legionellosis cannot be quantified. And therefore, you'll see no reference to risk assessment or quantifying risk in this standard. It's a risk characterization, which is very qualitative, not quantitative. It's about hazard analysis and hazard control. And the reason I bring it up now, Bob, is because a lot of the costs and a lot of the, I'll say the difficulties in risk assessment L8 style have to do with trying to document things that really should not be documented, or not, there shouldn't even be an attempt to document that. This standard, and really the World Health Organization approach, is not based on a quantitative assessment of risk. It's based on a quantitative assessment of hazard and hazard control. And this is the reason why HACCP for food service has been so incredibly powerful and successful. It's also the reason why this process has been used to such success in other non-food related industries, because it doesn't try to quantify risk. Okay, what's your other question, Bob?
Okay, this is Tim here, and we we're actually well over time, but if you don't mind, we just pick up one last question, if that's okay, Bill. And this question on testing. I've had a question actually from within the room here, being emailed to me, just asking about the reliability of testing. But also, I've got one in from Tristan DeCam, who poses a question that although he agrees with your analysis on test results, he says there's new technologies available, and it means nothing to me, but he mentions qPCR as being a method of testing which perhaps would overcome some of these issues and maybe reduce the need for this management standard. What do you feel about that?
Okay, thank you for that question. Very, very good question. qPCR, quantitative PCR, or real-time PCR, and any other analytical advancements are an important reason why the Standard Committee developed a standard practice which is not prescriptive. You see, what we decide as a Standard Committee is that innovation in the field of testing and innovation in the field of hazard control will be, it has in the past and will be in the future, an important part of preventing this hazard from harming people. And so the standard practice does not prohibit in any way the use of some other method other than culture for validating control. So let's say somebody does develop a qPCR method, which, by the way, at the moment would not be adequate in the view of, well, in my personal view, but I'll maybe just briefly say why in a minute. But let's say that a method which is adequate was developed for Legionella testing. This standard would welcome, and in fact, the standard would be a great friend to the innovator who improves on the analytical test method that we call the standard method. Because remember, the standard requires that you validate that the hazard has been controlled, but it doesn't say how you must validate. So those who are innovation-oriented should, in my opinion, applaud this standard, especially compared to those standards which are far too prescriptive in this area. And in some standards, like in France, not only must you do routine culturing, but you must use a government lab to do the test. You know, now that in the U.S. we see that as fraught with potential difficulty and also corruption. So, and I didn't mean to sound like an accusation or anything. I just meant that we know that innovation should be allowable with regard to the standard practice. Now, just one real quick word. PCR, quantitative PCR, real-time PCR, wonderful techniques. We do these in my lab. We do thousands and thousands every year. They're very, very powerful as a negative predictor. In other words, if the result is negative, then most often the cultures will come back negative also. Not always, but with a high level of predictive value, the negative predictive value is very good. However, the positive predictive value is not good. And that's, of course, because even the modern PCR protocols really do not differentiate adequately between viable and non-viable cells. And I know that's a point of debate. So I'm sure there's some in the room who would want to debate that, but I think I know that that's the technical consensus view.